from last class. So, hold on, let me get the PowerPoint going. Other way. Other way. Okay, great. So last class, we went over quite a lot of information. We went over sex, gender, and sexuality, which is basically everything that I specialize in, so it's a lot. I had asked you guys to watch 2 documentaries in lieu of the class that was canceled, The Mask You Live In and Paris is Burning, and realized after the fact that there was a lot of stuff in Paris is Burning that I really needed to unpack with you, especially given that it could be the first time some of you were encountering concepts related to transgender issues and kind of set a misleading implication that all drag queens identify as trans, which isn't the case, or that all drag queens are gay, which also isn't the case, or that all trans women are gay, which also isn't the case. So we sort of went through that not all drag queens are gay or identify as women, not all gay men identify as women, nor do they necessarily do drag, and not all transgender people can or want to pass as the gender that was not assigned to them as at birth, which for some of the drag is the point, is trying to pass. Hold on just one second. We also went over the difference between sex and gender. Does anyone remember what the basic difference is? Yeah, Carlos.
Sex is what you are biologically born with, and gender is more of a society-based concept.
Right, that's good. So there are 2 main things that are associated with this category of biological sex. Anyone remember what those 2 things are? Yeah, Val.
One is chromosomes,
Mm-hmm.
and
You know the other one. You know the other one. Chromosomes and what else? What's sex?
genitalia.
Right. So chromosomes and genitalia. And so those are basically the only things that are, like measurements of someone's sex. So say like in the Olympics, when there's controversy over, oh, is that person really a woman? She's so fast. And then they want to like see evidence of her chromosomes in order to know for sure that she's in the right category and is in fact belonging in the category for men. So those are the things that we use to identify someone's sex. Gender is basically everything else. So male and female refer to biological sex. Woman and man refer to someone's gender. Someone can have the biological determinants of sex for being male, but identify and live as a woman. And you would never know unless you slept with that person or saw, like a write-up from their doctor. You would not ever know what's in their pants because it doesn't really come up in everyday life except for things like the bathroom bills and the controversy over these other gender segregated spaces where presumably it matters quite a lot what genitalia you have because of people worrying about women seeing a penis and while they're going to the bathroom in a public space and some legitimate, some illegitimate reasons why that could be traumatic for people. So I showed you this image to try to get through some of these differentiations that we're talking about called the genderbread person. That basically sort of breaks down the main differences between gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation. And we went through the basic facts that, not every woman, person with female sex who identifies as woman is heterosexual. Sometimes they might be bi, sometimes they might be lesbian, sometimes someone has the biological sex of male but identifies as woman, such as a trans woman, and identifies as attracted to other women. Now, whether or not they identify that as meaning that they are lesbians, or if they identify as gay, sort of like hearkening back to when they were living as a man in society, that's a very complicated gray area that's totally up to the individual. And it's a really fascinating area of study that I'd be happy to talk to you about more later. but that's a whole different thing. So that's really the only thing that should be confusing about that, because it's confusing to experts in the field and people in those communities as well. So, just basically respect people's right to self-identify, and that all of these categories are fairly subjective and up to interpretation and differ per individual. So why does any of this matter? Well, for basic reasons that lead to gender inequality in our society. So in terms of why gender matters for men and women, it matters because women have lesser power in our patriarchal society than men do. This manifests in ways such as the wage gap, that women earn less than men in the same jobs, doing the same exact tasks, which came to light with the Hollywood wage controversy. It also matters with regards to how women get treated in our society because of this sort of conditioning that men and women experience, that women are not as powerful and somehow don't have the same rights as men. So this manifests as sexism, which can be both benevolent, such as a server calling you sweetheart, even though you do not know this person and may not be attracted to them at all, and may take quite a lot of umbrage at them putting you in this sexualized romantic role play with them for the moment when you're just ordering a sandwich. So that's an example of benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is a little bit more noticeable and something that people get a little bit more riled up about. One example we talked about was street harassment. Another example we talked about was rape culture, and a lot of women's constant awareness, if they are by themselves at night, that they could be raped. And all of the ways that this awareness seeps into women's consciousness and affects decisions that they make on a daily basis, such as how close do they live to the subway? Do they take a cab home or do they take the subway? Do they carry keys in their hands so that they have a sharp object that they could gouge someone's eyes out with if they needed to? These are all things that most women think about at some point or another in their lives, which is why there was the hashtag #YesAllWomen in response to the hashtag that was very defensive, not all men. It also is worth noting that there is some sexism within scenes that you might think are immune to sexism, such as the LGBTQ scene. There is, even within that scene, quite a lot of femphobia, or putting down of femininity compared to masculinity, including the fact that if you look at what it means to look androgynous, it tends to be more masculine than feminine. And yet this is taken as normative and as sort of like the staple. So there's a lot of shaming of women who are overtly feminine within these scenes as well, as though they're doing their gender or their sexuality wrong. Part of that is stuff like heteronormativity. How are you supposed to act as a heterosexual man? And also homonormativity. How are you supposed to act as a homosexual person? How are you supposed to express yourself? These are policing mechanisms, gender policing, as it manifests in different scenes. There's also an emerging awareness of transnormativity, or this notion that all transgender people need to sort of act alike, present a similar front to society, and gender policing within the transgender community as well, which some genderqueer peoples have spoken out about recently in my research. Anyway, all of this occurs within patriarchy, where men have the majority of the power. It doesn't mean we're blaming men, it just is. One of the ways that this hierarchy is preserved within the system is this power dynamic that has been called hegemonic masculinity, where practices and acts and behaviors that are associated with heterosexual white masculinity become valued more highly than similar behaviors, practices, etc., that are valued by women, associated with women, or associated with gay men, or even men of color. All of these become subordinated, become of lesser value than the ones that are associated with the white heterosexual middle class masculinity. And that is sort of how the power of the status quo is safe, even when all of these other movements arise fighting for equal rights for all of these marginalized parties. So we also talked about how one of the responses to patriarchy has been feminism, and the fact that feminism is a problematic concept to present as one unilateral entity, one thing, because there have been multiple waves of feminism throughout the 1900s and now 2000s, and also for the majority of feminism's history, it has been a predominantly white movement fighting for white women's equality to white men. And that has put black women in a really precarious position where they historically had to choose whether they were fighting for black rights or for women's rights. So this led to an emphasis within sociology to always focus on how things are intersectional. That is, how we all have multiple identities. None of us are just women in the room. All of the women in the room also belong to a race, also belong to one or multiple ethnicities, might belong to a religion, might all of us belong to a class status. These are all parts of our identities that make us intersectional. And it's false to talk about anything about all women or all men, with the possible exception of things that have to do with biological sex instead of gender, such as rapeability, and thus the hashtag #YesAllWomen having to do majorly with being rapeable and fearing for your safety in rape culture. But that's one of the only things that we can really talk about with regards to all women. And even that leaves out women who get misgendered as scary men because of being big, muscular, broad shoulders, wearing their hair short. They might say back, you know what, I actually don't feel afraid of getting raped when I'm out alone at night. So no, not all women. Okay, and we also mentioned at the end of that segment that men, of course, can be feminists too, because feminism means standing up for the equal rights, equal pay of women, and that they shouldn't have to be afraid of getting raped all the time, that maybe that's men's problem to work on and not women's problem to be in fear of and trying to ward off throughout their whole lives. So that's how gender inequality manifests for cisgender people. In other words, for people who have consistently identified with the gender that was assigned to them at birth. A different type of inequality manifests when you look at how people who identify comfortably as man or woman, even if they're transgender, they identify and express and maybe can even pass as man or woman, and thus get treated without confusion by society. They experience a very different society than people who are of ambiguous gender expression, whether intentionally or not, who get misgendered on a regular basis or confuse people and thus anger people because people don't like to be confused and to feel or look stupid. And so there's this concept that I introduced to you called binarism, discrimination against people who don't identify as man or woman, who identify as non-binary instead, as either both man or woman, neither man or woman, whatever, something other than man or woman. These people experience disproportionate rates of homelessness, of assault, they're in the lowest income category, even compared to binary transgender counterparts. They experience disproportionate discrimination because we want to be able to rely on a very clear-cut binary gender model where there's this category and nothing in between. But of course, these categories are socially constructed. We're going to get to this again when we talk about race, and I hope you see that it's sort of a pervading theme throughout a lot of things that we're talking about. That categories are simultaneously extremely real because they affect people's access to resources, their vulnerability to violence, how long they're going to wind up living perhaps. This also included class when we were talking about these categories. But they're also incredibly socially constructed and arbitrary. And so it's frustrating for people to try to educate the public about the fact that a lot of this is subject to negotiation. So we talked a little bit, this is where people started to get confused and where I got some muddiest point clarifications. One of them was about binary versus non-binary. Is that clear now? Yes? All right, making progress. So that's binary versus non-binary. We also talked a little bit about how people might transition were they to wish to pass or to feel more like the gender that they identify with as opposed to the gender that was assigned to them at birth. So some of the ways that people can do this was through surgical options, such as reassigning genitalia for people who are assigned female at birth, which we refer to in the shorthand as AFAB. They might get their breasts reduced. They might wear binders instead, things that compress their breasts. If they are afraid of surgery, can't afford surgery, whatever. Surgical options also include laser hair removal for facial hair if you were assigned male at birth and it's complicating your ability to pass and perhaps putting you in danger of transphobic attacks on you that could kill you. And there are also some plastic surgery options that people choose if their facial features prevent them from passing as a gender that they wish to pass as. Now, sometimes people don't want to do surgery or can't afford it, but they do want to have subtle changes to the way that they come across. And so they might take hormone replacement therapy options that change their vocal pitch, that maybe for people who are assigned female at birth, help them grow facial hair and body hair thicker. All sorts of things that change very subtly, including how you feel inside when you go on hormone therapy replacement. Now, some people are not trying to pass as a specific gender when they're doing these things. So, for example, genderqueer people, some of them also consider things like hormone replacement therapy or surgery, but sometimes with the goal of becoming even harder to place in a binary model. So mixing hues, for example, having a lot of facial hair, but also having breasts. This is something that people who are assigned female at birth can achieve with hormone replacement therapy. And also through pronoun requests, such as specifying my pronoun is they, or name changes to a name that's more ambiguous and less easily categorizable as a man's name or a woman's name. Any questions about that? I mean, you should have questions. It's very confusing, but I'm hoping that I'm presenting it as clearly as possible in the limited amount of time that we have. So we talked a little bit about how transphobia negatively impacts transgender people, the fear or hatred, prejudice against transgender people, and also transnormativity. So just as gender exists on a spectrum and is not just men or just women, in fact, people can switch or be neither, also sexuality is a spectrum. So how many of you were familiar with the Kinsey scale as a concept before our last class? So not very many of you. It's a great movie if you ever want to watch it. It's a brilliant movie. I think you can watch it on Netflix. Okay, so sexuality exists on a spectrum. Most people are familiar with the concept of bisexuality. So there's homosexuality, attracted to the same sex as yourself, and there's heterosexuality, attracted to the other sex, and then there are people who identify as bisexual because they're attracted to both. But there are also people who sort of lean more direction in one way than the other along that spectrum. So there are people who are mainly heterosexual, but for the right person would, have a homosexual relationship or at least sexual encounter at a party, for example. Or people who are mainly homosexual, but would do something with someone of the opposite sex if it was the right person. So these people are not exclusively at one end or the other. Similarly, there are people who identify as pretty strictly bisexual, where it's about half each time men, half each time women. But there are also people who are a little further to one side of that tail or the other. And some people, especially if they have been in relationships with transgender or genderqueer people, who don't like that bisexual implies that there are only two sexes to choose from, who prefer to identify as pansexual or omnisexual, one of these things that indicates that it's the entire spectrum and separates itself from this binary sexuality model. Is that clear? Are there any questions about that? No? Okay. So we also talked about how there is a difference between sexuality and sex acts. So just because you're gay doesn't mean you're ever going to have sex with a man. If you're living in a culture that is really dangerous to be openly gay, or you just never really like meet someone, you might never actually have sex acts that are associated with homosexuality, even though your sexuality is gay. So sex acts are different from sexuality. And also, some women get pressured into sex acts with other women, even though they're entirely heterosexual, just because men at a party are cheering for them to do it because it's titillating to them. So once again, these are two separate things, and it doesn't necessarily reflect upon your sexuality, the sex act that you engage in, even though that double standard seems to disproportionately mean that men who engage in a homosexual sex act are assumed to be homosexual, whereas women who engage in a homosexual sex act are still assumed to be heterosexual. They just like need the right guy to come along to change their mind. This is a common theme within a lot of pornography, as my advisor studies. And so at the end of our sexuality section, we talked a little bit about abstinence and celibacy. And so I had a few questions about that. I think most of you might be familiar with this move in our country during the Bush era to have abstinence-only sex education in school systems, basically saying don't give out condoms, don't teach them about safe sex, you're encouraging them to have sex underage if you do that. And so, of course, what happened? Teen pregnancy rates went on the rise, STDs went on the rise, abortions went on the rise because of all these unwanted teen pregnancies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now Obama has repealed funding to all schools that insist on doing abstinence-only sex education because of how ineffective it is, and instead is saying, no, we need to teach people how to have sex safely and protect themselves. However, even with all of that, there still is an emphasis on safety and no discussion of pleasure. And it's harder for a lot of women to orgasm than it is for men to orgasm. So our script as a society remains that sex ends when a man has an orgasm, and whether or not the woman had an orgasm is sort of up to her to somehow figure out and to somehow communicate to her partner, and that maybe if she just makes the right noises that she's heard in movies and in porn, she can fake it so at least he doesn't feel bad. And then you have women going their entire lifetimes never having an orgasm. And maybe the men don't even know it. And maybe the women don't even know it because we don't talk about it as a society. So that's another issue within the sex acts and sexuality category. Okay, and so then there's kind of a separate category of abstinence, which is celibacy, which is when for religious reasons you are abstaining from sex because of something having to do with your relationship to God or your desire for spiritual purity. We have a lot of born-again virgin movements in the United States among more evangelical branches of Christianity, where you may have had sex before, but now you're saying that you're not going to have sex again until you get married, and for all intents and purposes, you are living as a virgin, and you take a vow of celibacy. So that's sort of the difference there. Is that clear? Yeah? Groovy. Okay, let's see if there's anything else in this section. So here's a good transitional topic that we touched on very, very slightly at the end of class with our video clip, is that within these born-again virgin movements and everything, there's this assumption that basically sex is tainting and impure unless it's within the sanctity of marriage, unless it's within a marital union between two people. However, this is a little tricky because what if you never want to get married? What if you don't have the legal right to marry, which was the case for gay people in our society until very recently? And also it assumes that men are supposed to somehow be experienced with sex by the time they get married, but women are not supposed to be and are supposed to remain pure. So who are these men having sex with exactly? That's sort of something that never comes up in these discussions of the double standard of sexuality. And that is also part of why you see a big age disparity. So hookup culture is another example of how we privilege this notion of you're going to find one person who you have sex with for the rest of your life, except if you're a man. If you're a man, it's okay to do other things. So hookup culture and our conversations about it, we assume that women are getting duped into it, that they're getting hurt by it, but that men are just boys being boys. So that's another way that this manifests. I showed you a video clip on polyamory of people who are present with the fact that if they were to find themselves in a one-on-one relationship with someone, they would inevitably wind up cheating on them because they don't want to just be with one person. And so instead of living a lie or hurting people, they have open conversations about the fact that they are not content to only have sex with one person and find other people who are like-minded, who are happy to be in that type of open dialogue about how to negotiate sex with each other and with the fact that you'll be having sex with other people as well. Sometimes these turn into really serious, long-lasting arrangements between multiple people. It doesn't mean that the people who your partner is having sex with are having sex with each other. It doesn't mean that necessarily, although sometimes it can. And sometimes people with this type of arrangement, where it's very long-standing, they're very serious about it, decide to raise a family together. And so kids are raised with a more complicated family dynamic than we typically think of. This doesn't mean that the families are polygamous. They're not married to multiple people necessarily, but there are quite a few of these types of family units in the United States who don't come forward because of fear of stigma and also of possibly losing their children because of people not understanding what's going on. So they're also discriminated against, even though it's not even a legal union. Yes?
So is the difference between polyamory and polygamy really just the marriage certificate?
Basically, yeah. Which is why it's a little tricky that we don't have a non-legal word for monogamy. That while talking about people who are dating just one person exclusively, I still have to use a word that implies that they're married, which is a little weird. Okay, so this is a nice transition into our section that we're finally gonna do on marriage and family. Are there any questions though? No, okay. So, now that I no longer need to, yeah, Izzy.
Would you consider Mormon, like the culture, like the Korean women that they like include themselves in polyamory, so that would be like a polyamorous?
Well, first of all, it's only the more radical branch of Mormonism that practices polygamy, and most Mormons have disavowed it as an outdated custom that they no longer stand by. So it's really just like the extremists who still do it. Even though there are other religious sects that also still practice polygamy in our country.
They call it polygamy?
Yeah, so for them it is about marriage, it's about taking multiple wives, and so for that it is polygamy as opposed to polyamory. Yeah. Yeah. And I'd be happy to talk to people more about the stuff that I know about polyamorous culture later. One of my mentors, her research focuses on this. So today we're going to talk finally about marriage and family. It's not going to be very fun because I'm going to show you a few video clips about domestic violence. So just brace yourselves for that. It's not going to be graphic or anything. It's a TED Talk called Why Doesn't She Leave? And then I'm trying to end the segment on a more uplifting note by showing you a video clip about an intervention program. And then at the end of that, we're going to have our long break. And then we're going to do the autoethnography presentations. Once again, just very fast, just, tell us about your process. If you want, you can tell us what you wrote about. There were more of you who did this option than raised their hands indicating that they did it. So I'm not quite sure what that's about. I was surprised by how many autoethnographies I wound up grading. And then, if we have time, which we will, we'll do some of the content analyses, maybe all of them. And I asked you to have some sort of way to pull up a visual of what the media was that you analyzed. A few of you probably forgot and are super terrified right now. Those of you who are in that boat, we can arrange for you to present on Wednesday. But hopefully most of you remembered that I asked you to have it prepared today. And then at the end of class, I'm going to hand back your midterms and go over the grading rubric again, because there were a few of you who seemed to really not understand what I was asking for, which was sad for me, because those of you who didn't seem to understand also did not come to my office hours. So I'm thinking of requiring every single one of you who hasn't come to my office hours yet, and or when you talked to me didn't know what you were thinking of for your final project, to come to my office and talk to me about your final project. Because this one is worth 50% of your grade. And I am going to be heartbroken if, because you didn't put in the effort to talk to me, you get a bad grade in this class. Because I'm very happy to help you. Okay? Okay. Marriage and family. I'm going to turn off some of these front lights. And I also will give you a 5-minute break at some point during this lecture before all the video clips. Let's see, we figured this out, right? It was like something having to do with the top buttons. Yeah, all right. I'm gonna lower this blind. That's not the right way. That's the right way. Let's make it noise. Great. How many of you have seen Modern Family? Yeah, a lot of us. And also, Caleb, I reminded people at the beginning that computers aren't allowed anymore, unless you have a note from Disability Services saying you need it. Okay, so marriage and family. Obviously, the show Modern Family has sort of spread awareness of the fact that family in the United States no longer necessarily means a mom, a dad, a son, a daughter, and a 2-story house in the suburbs. That's actually much more complex and complicated than that, especially with the rise in divorces and remarriages and stepmoms and stepdads and, you know, step siblings and half brothers and half sisters and gay marriage and adoption within gay marriage and et cetera, polyamorous groupings, even though Modern Family doesn't get into that because it's on mainstream TV. So, marriage. First of all, how many people in this room would like to get married someday? I mean, I am married, so I guess I'll raise my hand. Yeah. Anyone, like, not want to get married? Yeah? Not as many? All right. I'm not going to put you on the spot by asking you why. But it tends to sort of be in our notions when we're in this society that sort of a sign of success is that you will get married someday, and that that's sort of your happy ending, even though obviously with divorce rates as high as they are, it's, you know, good not to take your spouse for granted and assume that they're your happy ending. Good to work on those relationships even after you've sealed the deal. So it's basically just a legally recognized social contract between two people, traditionally based on a sexual relationship and implying a permanence of the union. Variations include common law marriages. So when you've been living with someone for, it might be different in each state. In California, if you've been living with someone for 7 years or more, you are legally considered married by the state. They consider you like committed to each other in that way. So obviously like in a romantic coupling, not just your roommate. So these are considered common law marriages. If something happens to your partner and you need to be able to exercise certain rights that are usually reserved for spouses, you can bring up common law marriage as sort of like a caveat and try to wiggle your way into what you need. There's also polygamy. It's practiced in our country among more fundamental religious sects, including Judaism, Islam, and Mormonism. Is that still practiced in Judaism in the United States? It might not be practiced in Judaism. But there are sects of Islam and of Christianity that still practice it in the United States. And there are also open marriages where you're not polyamorous, you're not polygamous, you feel jealousy, you feel, you know, a desire to be with your one person for the rest of your life, but you also know that sometimes you're going to be tempted to cheat. And maybe your spouse will too. And instead of that ending the marriage and being like the end of the entire relationship, to have sort of like more of a, like, okay, so yeah, you'll do things with other people sometimes. Like, it's fine. Just come home to me. And as long as our relationship isn't damaged by it, it's, you know, not the end of the world, not a big deal, because I want to be allowed to also. And if I'm allowed to, that means I have to be okay with you doing it too. So this is a different category from polyamory because these people are committed to being an kind of exclusive unit, with this exception of getting some sexual desires out of your system. Has everyone heard of open marriages before? Anyone never hear of that before? Yeah. So, sort of like a response to high divorce rates. Whether or not you think it's a good idea, I guess, is up to you. So remember symbolic interactionism throughout this section, and the fact that marriage doesn't mean the same thing to everyone who's married. And it's hard to assume anything about a couple just based on knowing that they're married to each other. You don't know what the specific individual contract and agreement that those two people have reached about what it means to be married and living their lives together, what that means. Some high-powered couples go on business trips every single week away from each other for huge periods of time. And maybe they spend more time away from each other than with each other. Just because they're married doesn't mean that they have this intimate shared life together. I think some people speculate about that type of arrangement between Bill and Hillary, for example. And some people have very unhealthy relationships within their marriage. And it's not that they're in love with each other at all. It's because of some other reasons, perhaps based on power and fear, that they are together, or that one of them is with the other one. And in these relationships, you oftentimes domestic abuse and other things that we're going to talk about, marital rape, things like this, which are now thankfully illegal, but not until 1993 was marital rape considered a thing. It was just assumed that if you were married, you couldn't rape someone. Even though, once again, every marriage is different. Just because you're married doesn't mean you even spend time together. It might just be that someone's refusing to sign the divorce papers. So just remember that. Never assume that it's necessarily monogamous. Never assume they're in love. Never assume that they have sex. Never assume that they're both attracted to each other. One might be closeted and married to the other person for various reasons that don't have anything to do with what you'd assume a marriage is about. Never assume that a married couple wants to have kids. I have lots of friends who are married and have absolutely no intention of ever having kids. Yeah. So, it's socially constructed, doesn't require love. There are plenty of arranged marriages where love develops once they've been matched together based on various characteristics. That's something that the cultural relativity comes into play here, because we've been historically very quick to judge arranged marriages, and yet our dating apps function the exact same way now, of looking at a bunch of characteristics about the person and then matching people and hoping that love grows. So we have actually sort of moved away from a love-based model of marriage in our own society, that you're gonna see someone in the Trader Joe's wine aisle and your eyes will meet and you'll fall in love, which is my story with my husband, actually. We've moved away from that assumption and that model to more of a people are busy, you don't have time to waste on a bunch of dates that don't go anywhere because you have nothing in common, even if you're attracted to each other. Let's be practical about this. And whether or not those dating apps work is also up for debate, but that's a whole different thing. So types of marriage. 78% of cultures accept polygamy, being married to more than one person at a time. Usually polygamy means that it's one man married to multiple women, presumably because he can impregnate multiple women at a time and have more children throughout the life, although it also has functioned as a conspicuous display of wealth and power, that wives are expensive to keep, children are expensive to raise. So the more wives the man has, the wealthier he is, or at least seems to the other men in his society. So that's sort of like one historical explanation for how polygamy became fairly widespread. So there's also when one woman is married to more than one man at the same time. This is called polyandry, but it only occurs in about 1% of the world's cultures. Why do you think this is? Why are women marrying multiple men in the same cultures where it's okay for men to marry multiple women? Anyone? Yeah, Jessica.
It occurs in some societies where they have high female infanticide, so there aren't as many females of age, so they have to marry more men to them.
That is fascinating. Did everyone hear Jessica? You want to say it louder while I'm drinking water?
It happens in societies.
Sorry, go ahead.
It happens in societies where there's a high female infanticide rate. So basically, when women come to age, there are only so many for the men in the society, so they marry a bunch of men to one woman.
Right, so it's also something that some cultures have had to adopt just because of realities about the population. Okay. So we talked about cultural relativity earlier. So for example, the United States considers polygamy and bigamy, being married to two people, poly implies that it's more than two, to be illegal. So there's a lot of controversy over the Mormon Church continuing polygamy, which has inspired multiple TV shows that are very salacious and enjoyable. It's also practiced by some U.S. Muslims. And this is problematic that we consider it to be so problematic, given that in some other countries it's perfectly legal, and then people immigrate here and want to continue to live their culture and their lifestyle, and are not only told that it's wrong and that they need to be ashamed of it and keep it a secret, but even that they legally cannot do so. So that's sort of one example of tension there. I also want to just mention from some research I did for my master's thesis that this whole soulmate concept that is sort of the foundation of monogamy is an entirely Christian concept. So that's one reason why you see that it's still, polygamy has historically been fairly common in Muslim cultures. And then when Jews had to leave Israel, some of them went to Muslim-dominated cultures, some of them went to Christian-dominated cultures. The ones who went to Muslim-dominated cultures started to marry polygamously. The ones who went to Christian-dominated cultures were affected by this notion that their, sex is sinful and dirty and wrong unless it's with your soulmate, unless it's with the one person who you meet and realize this is the one, and you're with that person for the rest of your life. And so in some Christian communities, even after death, you are still considered married to that person and not allowed to remarry, because that was your one soulmate. You only had one shot. So this is an entirely Christian in origin concept that has now become kind of dominant as the norm, which some might argue is an example of Christonormativity and Christian privilege. Okay. Any questions about any of that? If you believe in soulmates, more power to you. I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm telling you the history behind these concepts. And I'm also not saying that all Muslim people are polygamous, much like not all Mormon people are polygamous. And I guess most Jews now are monogamous. Okay, so same-sex marriage. Like I said, what happens if you're legally not allowed to marry someone, and yet your sex is only pure and okay if you're in a legal marriage, which not only is problematic based on all of those sort of like sexual connotations, but also some religious connotations. So there are a lot of religious gay people. A lot. We don't talk about religion in queer studies very often because of this assumption, based on how atheist most academics are, that the people you're studying are also atheist, unless you specifically are studying religions. And yet, there is so much heartache in the LGBTQ communities over not feeling okay going home to their families of origin after they come out in college, because of how religious their families of origin are in a way that is homophobic and makes them feel like there's something bad and wrong about themselves for being gay. So this is definitely one aspect of intersectionality that needs to be addressed a little bit more often. And it's one reason why there was such a big push for same-sex marriage. It's not just that they wanted the legal rights and tax breaks that come with being married and to be allowed to adopt children, to raise children with the people who they love. It's also that if you are raised in a religion that tells you that sex is bad unless you're married to the person and you're gay and you're in love with someone, you want to be allowed to marry them so you can feel okay about your sexuality. So finally, same-sex marriage has become legal in all the states. I want to say all the states now, which when I entered this program 2 years ago, still wasn't the case. And my advisor was saying, oh, yep, nope, it's over for the people who are against this. This is just happening now. And a similar argument could be said for the bathroom controversy that's happening now, that in 2 years it'll be like, what? That was the thing? People said that wasn't allowed? Anyway, now people of the same sex can get married. It's fine. It's up to them. It doesn't have to be considered something separate from what heterosexual people experience, like calling it a union instead of a marriage, because marriage is, a religious term and this is a sin in the eyes of God, so we can't call it marriage. All of that stuff, the legal system has been like, you know what? You can argue about terminology on your own. We're going to grant them equal rights. Of course, this is still problematic within some religious communities. So I personally know and adore several rabbis who refuse to ordain same-sex couples because the ordination that they received doesn't acknowledge it or allow it. So no matter what their personal views, they're not allowed to perform marriages for same-sex couples. And there are a lot of religions like this, and denominations, where like their hands are tied, they're not allowed to perform that ceremony. And then you have to go to someone else if you want some sort of religious figure to be overseeing your ceremony. But how many people in this room know a same-sex married couple? Quite a lot. That's great. Same-sex unmarried couples? Yeah, most people, right? So not all gay people want to get married. This is another thing that wasn't talked about very much over the last couple of years. Some gay people really resent this notion that they have to be just like straight people in order to be okay in our society. And they feel that getting married is sort of a capitulation, sort of like giving in to this very heavy-handed message that you have to be just like straight people in order to be okay and in order to deserve basic human rights. So especially the sort of like more polyamorous contingents within LGBTQ culture really took some issue with this just like you type of message that the gay movement was sending during the last couple of years. Because there are a lot of things that are actually quite unique about LGBTQ culture that are not just like straight culture. And there are many rights that LGBTQ people need that are not rights that straight people need. So they're not just like straight people. But, of course, those who want to get married should be allowed to, and now they're allowed to. They are of similar demographics as opposite-sex couples across the board. They are just like you and me in that sense. And there's no different impact on the children that they raise just because they're same-sex couples as opposed to opposite-sex couples. If anything, as the textbook told us, lesbian couples' children tend to have higher self-esteem and fewer behavioral problems. So there goes that argument. Another type of union, cohabitation. How many people have cohabitated, have lived with a partner? I have. Maybe well, you guys are still young. Okay, never mind. So someday you might decide, for a wide variety of reasons, to move in with someone who you are dating or in some sort of relationship with. Anyone think of any reasons why this might be a decision that people make? Yeah, Jared. Financial reasons. Yes. Especially if you live in a city and you're spending every single night at your partner's house, never sleeping at your own house. It's basically just where you keep your things, and this goes on for months and months while you're paying $2,000 a month for the apartment that you're never living in. It might make sense to just have some faith that the relationship is gonna last and move in together. Any other reasons? Yeah, Izzy.
So like, I don't want to like test out how you guys look at them before you decide to marry.
Yep. Yeah. If you're getting really serious and talking about getting married, but haven't actually had to take the test of can you handle being in each other's hair all the time in the same living space, it might feel like a good idea to try that out. See if you guys are actually compatible as roommates as opposed to just going on dates. Any other reasons? Yeah, Carlos.
Just the desire to be closer to your partner.
Yeah? Desire just to be with them more. This is especially the case for people who are very busy, have like very busy schedules, and have a hard time scheduling dates with each other. To live with each other, you at least get some in-between moments and a sense of intimacy, and that, you know, you guys are committed to each other even if you don't have very much time to go on dates. Any other reasons? Not wanting to get married, but wanting to be together? People who don't want to get married ever? Political reasons, legal reasons. If you're still married to someone who's refusing to sign divorce papers, which can go on for an entire lifetime in the Orthodox Jewish community. Reluctance to commit. And if there's a religious conflict such that you can't get married the way that you want to in your denomination. Okay, yes. Okay, next slide. We already did this. I'm new to trying to animate slides. I won't do it at the conference in a month. But you guys are a good testing ground. Okay, so staying single. Why might someone not want to get married? Besides the reasons I've said. Or including the reasons I've said. You can recap for everyone. Anyone. Why might you not want to get married? Val.
So they don't feel tied down.
Yeah, so you won't feel tied down? Yeah, Izzy.
You come from like a divorced family.
You come from a divorced family. Yep. And don't believe that it'll last. Yeah, Naveen. You were going to say the same thing. Any other reasons? Okay. Izzy.
Anyone who is like happy going out with someone and not getting married.
Right? If it's not broke, don't fix it. If your relationship's going great without being married, do you have to get married? So the highest rates of cohabitation are in city centers, and also the highest rates of staying single are in city centers. And NYC is the highest place where people refuse to commit to each other and just stay single and dating. This, based on anecdotal evidence of a lot of my friends, is a very bad situation for women who are dating in New York City. Basically because there's this notion that there are so many, there's an endless supply of beautiful, sexy, attractive, like high-achieving women. Why would a man want to settle down and commit to just one? And so a lot of my girlfriends who are still dating, because mind you, I'm younger than I might seem, feel like they're treated as very disposable in the dating world and have to be like a huge catch and put on this big performance when they go on dates in order to even hear back from the person a second time. So people aren't necessarily committing to each other in the city, even if they're going on a lot of dates and using a lot of dating apps and a lot of hookup apps. In our culture, there's a big double standard around the value of staying single, where it's valued much more highly for a man to refuse to settle down and to stay a bachelor for the rest of his life than it is for a woman. And you see this in part in the different ceremonies for bachelor parties and bachelorette parties, where bachelorette parties are this big celebration that you're finally, taking his last name and becoming the person that you always hoped to be, to have the wedding, to belong to someone, to start your life. Yay! And then these are sweeping stereotypes Then on the man side, there's like this like, oh, this is the last night. This is the last night. It's very like funerary. It's like he's dying. And they're like, you know, toasting to like him who will never be again because now he's getting married. And, you know, then like in comes the stripper so he can like get it out of his system one last time before never being allowed to look at another woman again. These are very different messages that we send people. And they're not just descriptive of how it feels to be getting married as the different genders, they're also prescriptive. They encourage people to feel and think this way about what it means to get married based on what gender they are. You'll see it in cards in like the Hallmark aisle of grocery stores if you're looking for bachelor or bachelorette party cards. This is how we as a society have decided to talk about what marriage means, that it's a loss for the man and a gain for the woman. Whereas when you actually look at how many hours a wife puts into housework and cooking and cleaning compared to most men in heterosexual relationships, you see that the man is gaining significantly by getting married in a way that enables him to focus on his career more. It gains him status in the professional world. Whereas for a woman, it takes, these are sweeping generalizations, but that's what we do in sociology sometimes. It takes extra hours that you, when you were single, weren't spending on cooking and cleaning, because now you're doing it for the entire household and for him as well. And the stakes are higher because what it means is different, because now you're a spouse instead of just making yourself some food before you watch the Gilmore Girls revival. So, you know, this is sort of another example of the gender double standard and how it affects our experiences of what seem to be objective reality. And also how misogyny, how the hatred of women is built into even seemingly really happy, sweet moments. Any questions?